The Tiger King was filmed over 5 years and follows the life of Joe Exotic, born Joseph Strivogel, a gay, gunslinging, drug-using rock star hillbilly married to 2 men who both later claimed to be straight. Joe owns a park in Oklahoma called GW Zoo, and they have a collection of big cats and employ a cast of characters like a guy who came to feed a bear and just stayed on as an employee for over a decade. Apparently, big cats have this power over people. For example, a woman working at the zoo lost her arm after it was bitten off by a tiger, but due to her love of animals, she was back within 7 days. The employees earned about $130 a week for 12-hour days of hard labor, but they got to live in cockroach-infested motorhomes, eat expired steaks from Walmart, and play with tigers all day, so I guess it evens out. You also get to meet some other big cat enthusiasts like Doc Antle, who owns Myrtle Beach Safari and has 3 or 4 or 5 or 9 wives. Nobody really knows, but his son describes him as a Bhagavan, which means the blessed or fortunate one in Hindu. Another character is Mario Tabraue, notorious drug kingpin who was sentenced to 100 years in prison but got out early. He's also an exotic animal dealer and is described as the inspiration for Tony Montana in Scarface. Essentially, they make money by having people come to their zoos, pet the cubs, and experience wildlife up close, but you also get the sense that they all participate in the illegal sale of these endangered animals as well. Joe Exotic would frequently get hired by malls to show off his animals and promote the conservation of their habitat. Everything was going just fine until Carole Baskin, an animal rights activist who also happens to have a few cats in cages and probably used to breed them, but that's beside the point. Anyway, now she owns Big Cat Rescue and is trying to stop Joe Exotic from essentially doing the same thing she does. Joe describes her as wanting to have full control over all the cats. But wait, there's more, because in 1997, Carole's former husband Don Lewis disappeared and was never found. Law enforcement believe he was murdered. How and where, they have no idea. Joe believes Carole did it and buried him under the sewer. Some friends of Don believe he was fed to the cats. Other theories include a business deal gone wrong and Don just wandering off. All that's known is that his disappearance came right as their marriage was falling apart. Don's friends recall that the last time they spoke, he was talking about how he was going to ask Carole for a divorce. Other details of the case include the suspicious fact that Mr. Lewis's will was stolen by Carole, and when it was formally presented, it led with, "Upon my disappearance," which isn't usually found in wills. Don was very wealthy, and Carole got nearly all his assets after declaring him dead exactly 5 years and 1 day after he disappeared. In Florida, someone who goes missing can be declared dead after 5 years. We got a little sidetracked there, but essentially Carole believes Joe is abusing animals, so emails all the places that he would usually be performing at, telling them not to hire him. Joe eventually renames his traveling circus Big Cat Rescue Entertainment to try to rank higher on Google than Carole's Big Cat Rescue Corporation. Carole ended up suing Joe for copyright infringement and won over $1 million in the case, but Joe couldn't pay back the money, so the court ordered him to give up possessions. Joe had registered almost everything in someone else's name, so everything that he actually owned, Carole wanted. For example, his watch, which, rather than handing over, he decides to blow up. Now would probably be a good time to tell you about Joe's internet show, which seemingly only existed for the sole purpose of talking smack about Carole Baskin. On the show, they would do things like shoot mannequins of Carole, send her poisonous snakes in the mail, talk about getting her head in a bottle, and, last but certainly not least, write songs and make music videos about how she killed her husband. The show was produced by Rick Kirkham, who in exchange for making his nightly series got full rights to a reality TV show about GW Zoo. Cameras were always rolling, and Joe became paranoid that the footage would get sold to Carole. All footage was stored in the production studio, which conveniently burnt down in what was clearly an act of arson. After all Rick's work went up in smoke, he left GW Zoo, where he was living throughout the production. Did Joe Exotic start the fire? No, he couldn't have because he was away at a funeral. Was he involved? Most likely. Meanwhile, in Florida, Carole is still trying to collect on the $1 million settlement. Lucky for Joe, a guy by the name of Jeff Lowe steps up to pay the debt. Jeff was a playboy who drove Ferraris and partied nights away in Vegas. Lowe portrayed himself as a very wealthy man, and Joe bowed down to him. The only problem was he didn't actually have any money. Or at least not as much as he said he did. Jeff was a bit of a con man and eventually ended up owning the park, slowly taking it over, beginning with an overhaul of the staff. The first one to be brought on was his handyman Alan Glover, who would eventually be hired by Joe to kill Carole Baskin. But before that, Joe would run for president. After his unsuccessful 2016 presidential campaign, he decided to run for Oklahoma governor under the Libertarian Party. His campaign manager, Joshua Dial, who was a Walmart manager that Joe met on one of his daily trips to pick up bullets and explosives, has stated that Joe didn't know what a libertarian was, and running the campaign was the worst decision he ever made. Joe surprisingly ended up getting third in the Libertarian primary, claiming nearly 19% of the vote. Unfortunately for Joe, things began to come down fast after an FBI investigation found that he'd hired one of his staff to go down to Florida and kill Carole Baskin. Ultimately, the hitman decided not to follow through, but because there was no crime or proof of payment, the FBI were unable to prosecute. However, Jeff Lowe got his friend Alan Glover, the same guy who bailed on the murder, to confess to being paid $3,000 to carry out the crime. Whether this was made up by Jeff to get some good graces with the FBI is hard to tell. But it did lead to Joe's arrest, and on January 22, 2020, he was sentenced to 2 counts of murder for hire, 8 counts of falsifying wildlife records, and 9 counts of violating the Endangered Species Act. He was sentenced to 22 years in prison. In the end, this is really just a story of a bunch of people who hate each other, and although their intentions might have been good at the beginning, they got drawn down this horrible path, and no animals were really helped in the end. GW Zoo was shut down by Jeff Lowe, but he hopes to open a new Oklahoma zoo in summer 2020. There's also been some talk about him possibly being investigated, and this story is far from over. So, until then, thanks for watching.